So Parham asked if we wouldn't mind just having a fireside chat style conversation regarding some of the intricacies involved in defending a critical infrastructure company that's what I would call non-traditional in nature. So I asked Scott if he would join us, and if you wouldn't mind, Scott, just jumping in, kind of describing your role in your company and some of the unique challenges you have.
Sure. AES is a global corporation. We're in 17 countries worldwide. We look and structure somewhat like a holding company. We have independent companies globally. Many of them are generation facilities, and we have several utilities as well. 2/3 of our revenue comes from outside the United States. And we have, various cultures. As I like to say, it's a whole lot different in Kazakhstan than it is in Indianapolis. So I'm the CISO. This is my 3rd year as the CISO. I'm the very first one in the corporation. So it's an interesting journey, and that's the way I consider cybersecurity a journey anyway that's never been done. But we've made a lot of progress in the last few years.
Awesome. So one of the things I think is interesting is when you look at the way we're currently approaching cybersecurity in the industrial control system environment, we tend to approach it with a somewhat myopic view that we're only working on one isolated plant or one company that has a few plants. Can you describe some of the challenges you have with as much interconnectivity as you have between not only your plants, but indeed the whole entire world?
Sure. So as we talked a little bit about this morning, and I think everyone knows, the air gap's a myth. It's a myth that industrial control systems, or in our case, our plant control systems, are not connected. They are to the internet. In addition to that, overlaid on top of that, we have a global network, global MPLS network that connects all of our locations globally for communication, sharing information and data, et cetera. So I think one of the challenges is we also have a different regulatory environment or no regulatory environment in some cases in different parts of the world. Fairly strong regulations in the United States, as we know. A lot of our infrastructure comes under what's called NERC-CIP, Critical Infrastructure Protection, number 5, which will be, I think, July now we have to meet it. But many of our other countries have none, or very little, or they're just starting to build on that. And Eric and I were discussing prior that this notion, and it's frankly sometimes I think our United States government is this way too, this notion that we're a country and your network stops at the borders doesn't really work for me. I have to consider one global network, and that something that happens in Kazakhstan or something that happens in Vietnam will impact someone in Indianapolis, in my case, since that's one of our utilities. So that's one of the challenges that I have to face, this fabric of not only locations geographically, I have cultures, I have multiple languages that I have to deal with, and frankly, the cultures and the human element, as you all know, is huge. But when you lay culture on top of that, they don't have the same level of information, the same level of knowledge, and the same culture ubiquitously across the board. So driving that culture to cybersecurity awareness, a general foundational part of cybersecurity awareness globally, is one of my biggest challenges.
So let me just ask you outright, what is the approach? We've got a geographically dispersed network that's highly interconnected. You have cultural problems, you have awareness problems, you have technology problems, you have process problems. It sounds like a really big elephant. So what is your approach to how you're actually going to eat it one bite at a time?
So, excellent question. What we endeavored to do a few years ago after we did a worldwide global assessment on our businesses, and just to give you a little background, we probably had 10 more countries at that point. As part of our business strategy, we're pulling back some places. I had Africa at that point, a couple places in Africa and some other locations. And Frank, what I forgot to mention is most of our locations are in the developing world. So we looked at it, we did an assessment globally, and we found a big unevenness across the board in terms of where we were at the basics of cybersecurity knowledge. So one of my goals was to float the AES boat, so to speak, and get some foundational knowledge across the globe and at our businesses. So what we did was we came together and put together a group of what we call cybersecurity guidelines. Any other company would call them policy. That's just a legal issue for us. And we put together these policies that are very core foundational, as I mentioned, and all of us in this room would consider, wow, those are pretty basic, like segregation, segmentation between the control systems and the enterprise network, the need for antivirus, the need for patching, the need for hardware inventories, software inventories. But you know what, as I mentioned, that's not necessarily true in some of the other countries, even on the IT side in some cases. So we put together these guidelines globally, and we said everyone has to adhere to them. They call them guidelines, but they're mandatory. And based on that basic structure, those businesses have to meet the guidelines. Now, we have some governance over on top of that, governance through audits, governance through communications, governance through vulnerability assessments, but that's the core of what we did. We started with 9, we're at 16 now, and those aren't, necessarily prescriptive that every one is one discrete item, but it governs everything, as I said, from an infrastructure standpoint, everything from protection, detection, communications, and governance.
So one thing that I believe quite firmly is that compliance does not equal security, and I have a lot of reservations about the way we here in the United States do regulatory compliance, and in a lot of cases I've seen instances where some compliance effort actually goes in the face of attaining real security. So how do you balance, as a multinational company, being compliant across the entire globe and meeting all the different privacy protections and data protections and regulatory compliance, yet still maintaining a consistent level of security and not being overly burdensome to the people who, in addition to all of this, actually have a real job they have to do? Yeah,
it's an excellent point, and Eric and I have the same view on compliance doesn't equal security, because I think it fosters, in some cases, a checklist mentality, which is not a security program, in my opinion. So, what we need to do is make sure that our program is robust enough through communications and through talking with our individuals out there that have to implement the guidelines so that they actually understand the intent. We also have a strong relationship with our audit organization, although in most companies I think audit is a bad word. In ours, we really want it to improve operations globally. And to give you an indication that different, that audit organization and myself, we both report to the same person. It's really to improve operations globally. So rather than just have a checklist mentality, we actually take the feedback from those audits. We understand and we share that with our global partners through various communication mechanisms. For example, I hold a bi-monthly now Cybersecurity Global Council where all members get on a video conference network that we have across our network, and we share ideas, we share what happened, we try to understand the uniquenesses in each business, in each country, so that we can apply those guidelines in the best way possible.
Excellent. So I think another point that just came to mind is, one of the very commonalities that we see today, or the commonalities we see today, is in this threat intelligence sharing, if you will. Now, the efficacy of that will be outside the scope of this conversation, but how do you go about balancing the need? So we've heard several times today, let's have this deeper and more meaningful relationship, this private-public partnership, if you will. And so a lot of this relationship is predicated on the fact that we're not supposed to share sensitive information in either direction that it's given between your company and the United States government. Well, how do you actually take that operational intelligence and act on it when you have a real vested interest in countries like Kazakhstan or other sensitive areas?
So it's a great question. I consider our ability to share, our ability to have visibility globally is one of the strengths that we can develop and that I can develop for our business. We have, along with that, we have strong partnerships. In one of the cases I'm thinking of is with the Department of Homeland Security. We have a CRADA with them, which is a cooperative relationship to share information between themselves and us. And we do share information. We're very careful. We share it inside the company only, but we do in fact share that information, everything from threat intelligence in some cases, not classified, but unclassified threat intelligence information, and also indicators of compromise where we can. So it's really important to communicate, as we know. It's really important to share that information. And as long as we do it within the right boundaries, I think we're okay.
So we've talked a lot about the people aspect. Let's talk a little bit about the technology. So understanding that you have, I mean, industrial control systems in their very nature, no matter where they are in the world, tend to be a little bit older, if you will, a little bit lagging behind the times. But in your particular case, where you've got systems in Vietnam and systems in Brazil and systems in the US, we all know that complexity is the enemy of security, and you have a really wide swath of technology. So how are you working to standardize them in order to minimize your attack surface?
So good, another great question. So I inherited what I call the Rainbow Coalition of Control Systems. I think right now we have 130 or so, and we have, I think, just about every major what we call OEM vendor that we would all think of. Anybody's familiar here. Emerson, GE, ABB, you name it. I probably missed one. I mean, there's probably 5 or 6. So again, what I mentioned to you before, the core is the guidelines. So the concept, for example, I'll just use this as an example, of segmentation or segregation, those apply regardless, regardless of the age. And Eric's right, I have everything from plant control system in Vietnam, which is our newest plant that got commissioned, I think, last year, to plants that are probably 35 or 40 years old. That doesn't mean they haven't had a control system upgrade in them, but some of their base technology is very old. So we try to apply those principles of those policies or guidelines globally. In addition to that, we have several other prongs of our approach, right? One is on, as Eric mentioned, the technology side. We're actually working with our construction organization to say, hey, instead of decisions being made locally, as they've been done in the last 30 years or 35 for our company, because again, think of it as a holding company, those businesses could make those own decisions. How do we make them as an organization? How do we weigh in as a security organization to make sure that we have an opinion and are putting a risk factor on that control system? So we talked to them about that to actually minimize our attack surface globally in terms of, just the sheer number that we have to deal with. In addition to that, we have an initiative underway where we are sitting down with those OEM providers that we have, especially the major ones, because we know we will shrink from whatever we have today, let's say 10 different ones, down to probably 1 or 2 over the next several years as we refresh or build new plants. But we're working with the security folks for those OEM providers to understand what their strategy is, what they're doing today, what the future holds. We want a strong partnership with them to understand what they're doing and to actually influence what they do in the future. And influence in a positive way to make sure that when we have a new plant put in, it meets all our requirements right away, instead of going back and say, they're not done. I remember Vietnam a couple years ago, and it was right after I got appointed, and I said, we cannot let Vietnam come online and not meet any of our standards. It's ridiculous. So we had to go in there, and of course, for those of you who don't know, it's not like, building a power plant is not like going out and buying a used car. It takes 5 or 6 years at least to get one built. So, but we had to go back and retrofit our security standards on top of after all the base technology, and we don't want that in the future. We want to have a strong partnership, and to some extent I want to take it out of our construction organization's hands and say, you got a couple flavors of control systems here you can choose from A or B. Here we're going to weigh in on the security aspects of each one, who's good, who's bad, and take everything into consideration from a risk rating standpoint, and then you put these in and we're good to go.
Outstanding. So one final question before they haul us off the stage here is pertaining to workforce and workforce development and availability of real cyber skills. So in my experience, there seems to be a strong contingent in the world in general for IT knowledge, right? There's a lot of good IT security folks out there, and there's a lot of good OT engineers, but there seems to be very few people who are properly skilled in actually performing ICS cybersecurity. And whereas you have a presence in 17 different countries and so many different plants, it seems unreasonable to think that you could actually place a cyber expert within every single plant. As such, I know you've discussed moving to a more centralized security model. Can you talk a little bit about what such a model would look like?
I can. And if you recall, for the first few years, we really put in a lot of foundational principles and policies so that we could, as I said, float the AES boat and get everyone to start understanding the processes, the principles, the technology that really gave us a foundation. But Eric's right. We're moving into the next phase of the strategy that we laid out, where we're going to set up what we call a cybersecurity practice Whereas before we had global governance, but individual localized implementation, we're going to move to global governance, more centralized practice, and some local hands-on implementation needed. And what that's going to look like is, because of the strength of the United States, we'll center the practice in the United States geographical area. We'll have the governance right here in Arlington, Virginia, under myself. And that practice, they'll have some eyes and hands locally if someone has to go install a firewall, maybe do some local configurations, do some cyber awareness training, depending on the level of technical expertise required. But the practice itself will have Tier 1 and 2 SOC capabilities, or Tier 1 SOC capabilities, Tier 2 ability as well. And then there'll also be components of all the other parts of the program, such as vulnerability management, that will manage those components as well. So we have much more centralized control. And I really see it as more just a natural progression of where we need to go at this point. But we all know the huge deficit of cybersecurity resources are going to be, I think it's 2 million in the next few years. So we're going to have a challenge. We will have a combination at the end of the day, I believe, between partners that we partner with, Cylance being one of them, and doing some of the work internally where we can. But we are not a high technology company. For anyone that knows the power industry, it hasn't changed in probably 100+ years, just some of the base technology. But you know what? You're still heating stuff up, and you're still turning the turbine, and you're still making power. It's the same. So we need to go with our core strength and make sure that we're doing what we do best, which is producing power and distributing power. We will not have a huge cybersecurity team at the end of the day, internal to the company. I don't think we'll be able to keep up ourselves.
Awesome. Well, I think before they haul us off, if there's any questions for Scott now, for everyone's benefit, or if not, he really does have unique viewpoints. I'd encourage everybody to pick his brain a little bit over beer here in a little while.
Yes, sir.
Question right here. Oh. We'll need someone official to this. Go ahead.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, one thing that I like that you were talking about is being able to take sort of your business mission and tie that into being able to execute your cyber strategy. And I would like to have you share a little bit, for many organizations, that's a big struggle, to kind of get the senior leadership involved in understanding that there is a strategy, that this is a critical component, and to be able to hold up the deployment of a power plant for cybersecurity. That's a big deal to me from looking at the industry as a whole. So I'd like to kind of get some more information from you on how are you able to communicate cyber risks to your executives and to also get their buy-in to support the things that need to happen.
So thank you for that question. It's as I mentioned earlier, it's been a journey. We've come a long way, and I sometimes lose sight of that in 3 years when you're marred in the day-to-day issues. One of the things that helped us is we have a very strong safety culture in our company. Unfortunately, I work in an industry that's very dangerous, and we lose people every year just because of safety issues that we consider all preventable. So I have hitched up the wagon, so to speak, and said, you know what, cybersecurity is part of safety. It should be part of our culture. And because we've really made a hard push for that the safety culture worldwide in the past 7 to 10 years, it's been easy for people to make that connection and say cybersecurity is really part of our safety and make it part of that. The other thing that's helped is just the sheer amount of, I was mentioning this to Eric, the sheer amount of media and press, good or bad, that's happening in the United States. I don't think there's a day that goes by there's not some article written somewhere, some post written somewhere that talks about that. And I have seen a market change in the last year, really, by both our board and our executives on the risk of cybersecurity. And that leads me to the final point on that is cybersecurity is just one other risk that executives have to deal with. In fact, where we are, frankly, a lot of times it's not the highest risk that they have in their country. It could be everything from commodity risk to not raining enough in South America to indigenous tribes not happy with us because we're building a hydro plant on their land. I mean, there are a lot of things that go on that we have to take into consideration. But what I think I have been successful talking to them about is the risk aspect of it and making it less what I call cyber fog and more another business risk that they have to deal with.
Was there a question over here?
In thinking about some of the push toward renewable energies, such as solar and wind, there's a need to synchronize those with the grid in terms of phase synchronization. And one of the concerns was the cyber vulnerabilities associated with widely distributed synchrophasers across your network. And so perhaps could you address what's being done in the industry to harden those?
So I don't know if I'm the best position to say what's being done in the entire industry, but I can talk a little bit about what we're doing. So AES has, if I look at our portfolio, at some time in the last 10 years, we've had, I think, every type of generation electricity one way or the other, whether it's wind, solar, bio. We're big in energy storage. We're the world leader right now. We also have the rooftop solar, et cetera. So we look at those things from a cybersecurity standpoint as just another technology that we have to deal with. And in fact, some of the components and some of the guidelines, we look at them having to apply the same way. So we see it as a big challenge, however. If you think about everyone having a microgrid or, being able to produce power on their roof in a neighborhood and those feeding into the grid, that level of cybersecurity, and then if I add on the Internet of Things on top of that, it multiplies, as we talked earlier this morning, the attack surfaces, probably thousands fold, right? So it is a challenge for us, but I think we have to stop looking at them as technology we can't deal with, embrace the technology, because at some level, someone is going to have to monitor those control systems, even if they're minor control systems or small. Take a look at what the attack vectors are, and manage them accordingly. So I don't think there's a silver bullet there. I think, though, what we have to do is embrace it and make sure that, for me, I have to treat it just as another part of my portfolio that I have to guard against.
Okay, anyone else? Parham's waving at us over here.
Unfortunately, we're out of time for questions, but I do want to.
Excellent. Well, Scott, thank you very much.
Thanks, sir.